Hello, folks. Happy Sunday, and I guess welcome to the Fireplace. Although now I'm thinking about calling it the 8:30 because that's how people are referring to it on Facebook when I'm like the live, and they're like, "Oh, the 8:30." Anyway, it is Sunday, and I'm feeling a bit tired, so I don't know how long we're going to go at this tonight, unless a lot of people show up, which honestly on Sundays folks have been doing. But we'll see what happens. Of course, regardless of how I feel, I did go through the trouble of compiling a fair amount of news, but I figured we'd take it kind of easy and largely talk about things that I find interesting today. And if I was a problem with that, tough, I guess. But it's not like I guess some people might have figured it out, but it's not like this is my job. Although if folks want to send me some money, Benjamin-Yee on Venmo. But looks like folks are jumping in, so I figure we'll start with, obviously the news items as usual, some headline stuff, and then I got some interesting discussion things to talk about, mainly Asia today. So we'll get into that. But first, I wanted to mention it was in the news. I don't know if you heard. New York City, Bill de Blasio is proposing some pretty big cuts to education. And this is because, like every other government, there's a huge decline in tax receipts because of the diminished economic activity due to the pandemic. So New York City is facing a funding gap, or at least a revenue gap between expenses and tax receipts of $7.4 billion. And so de Blasio is proposing education cuts of $827 million. These are pretty big cuts to an education system, which is in theory something like $700 million under the formulaic funding it's supposed to receive in the budget already. But relative to the overall decrease in tax receipts or the overall gap, it's like 10%. That's kind of big, actually. I wonder what else is getting cut. We spoke yesterday about how there's protected spending, pensions and what have you, and then discretionary spending. What this would ultimately be, though, is a hiring freeze, a reduction of school counselors. So that's actually going down, and then a reduction in operating budgets. So not great. There have also been another 150 million or so cuts to education already announced. So not the greatest, but we are going to see belt tightening in all aspects of government services because of the decline in tax receipts and the fact that only the federal government can borrow unlimitedly. Also, I wanted to touch on something, an extension of yesterday. Yesterday, we spoke about unscrupulous landlords and what folks can do if landlords are applying sexual pressure to tenants who can't pay. Well, as it turns out, there was another story about unscrupulous landlords today. Somebody realized that their landlord went and used their social security number, which is often provided for a background check before you move in, to find out whether or not they had received their stimulus check. By the way, you can check out where your stimulus check went, whether or not it was sent to you, what the holdup is at Where's My Check, which is a program and app run by the IRS. That being said, it looks like it's super illegal to use somebody, for a landlord to use a tenant's social security number without their permission to look up whether or not they got their stimulus check, basically to see whether or not they'd be able to pay rent or some portion of rent. So if you or somebody has had this to them, call up your state attorney general. That was the advice that was given. So yeah, super illegal. Additionally, just some quick headlines we're working through. United States Postal Service. We've spoken a bunch about how that's Trump's at war with them. Just wanted to point out one of the groups that will be hit hardest by this. Of course, the Postal Service employees. They employ a couple of tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands, rather, I should say, disabled veterans. So that is a group which, honestly, Republicans are constantly talking about how much they love the troops, but apparently they only love the troops when they're killing people, because once they come back and they need jobs and they're disabled and they enter programs like the ones in the Postal Service to employ disabled veterans, they couldn't care less about funding their needs or taking care of them. So the consequences of defunding or failing to bail out the United States Postal Service again, which is going to happen in September, October, coming up quick, are numerous. No mail, no vote by mail, people incapable of getting supplies to rural areas where FedEx and UPS simply don't deliver, or it costs astronomical amounts. On top of all of that, on top of the layoffs we're going to see, now we've got a group which is particularly vulnerable, disabled people and veterans being laid off. So I really hope that Congress figures out how to get something passed, but Donald Trump seems dead set against it because he seems to think, at least his argument, is that it's helping his old enemy Bezos. Billionaire feuds. All right. One last extension from yesterday, and then we'll get to sort of like new stuff. But as we've been talking about for the last several days, the small business program has completely dried up from funds, and how Congress is not extending that program or expanding that program because of holdups regarding desires by Democrats to add additional funds for hospitals and states. Well, I just got the numbers about the size, the types of businesses that got these loans. We mentioned a little bit yesterday that really large corporations were getting these loans. And as it turns out, the percentage of applications that were under $150,000 were virtually nearly 75% of all applications for Paycheck Protection Program loans and grants. Now, mind you, if you use this to keep people employed, as a lot of these smaller companies would do, then it becomes a grant. So it's actually free money. Of the money given out, applications under $150,000 were somewhere in the range of 15 or 16%. Now, applications for over $1 million in loans, that's something like 5% of all applications. But they received almost 50%, really something like 45% of all the money, even though they comprised 5% of applications. Banks were really into, clearly, giving out large loans to large corporations. We're talking $1 million, $10 million at a time. And something that was brought to my attention was Shake Shack got one of these loans. But it's a huge deal for them because they're not going to use it to hire more employees or preserve the employees that they have. They're running on skeleton crew because of the pandemic. The CEO of Shake Shack said that at this moment, what they're most interested in doing is expanding their real estate holdings. Real estate holdings. Now, what's the value of this if it's just a loan? Well, these government loans are incredibly cheap. They're subsidized, and they're only 1% interest rate. So you can imagine that a lot of these companies, these large companies, already have loans that they've taken out and that they're using to finance operations or invest in infrastructure or capital. But those loans are at something like market rate. Maybe it's somewhere between 4 and 6%. Refinancing that for a 1% loan is a tremendous deal, and the federal government just letting them get away with it. It doesn't matter that it would have been free money for small businesses that use it to keep employees on. It doesn't even matter to these companies that they could get free money to keep employees employed. That's not economically productive for them. They can take it, use it for things that they were using other loans to satisfy, and then drop the interest rate, pay back those loans, and then drop the interest rate to 1%, which is just, wow, what a scam. In any event, I really hope that whatever expansion of that program ends up being, really taking into account the structure for who is eligible. That being said, it was brought to my attention as well in a conversation from somebody who was defending the banks that while this certainly looks egregious, there was very little to no guidance on how the banks should be giving out the loans. And furthermore, and maybe more importantly, there was no guidelines given for what should happen if banks gave money to a fraudulent claim or a fraudulent application. And in that world, the risk aversion of banks pushes them, in fact, to give to pre-existing clients that they know are real or that they know are credible. That said, these are banks. They have the resources to do the work. The problem is that the amount of money they get for filing these loans and applications is not, I don't even want to say not worth it, because the thing is, it doesn't incentivize them to enough. It doesn't incentivize them properly to do smaller loans. It doesn't incentivize them properly to do the diligence work on guaranteeing or weeding out the bad actors, because they're just not making enough profit. And the percentage that they make on a loan isn't stepped highly enough to create the value in doing the small business work. So they just gave it all to big businesses. Real bummer. But that being said, let's talk about some really interesting things that are going on in the world, mainly Asia. And, we don't talk a lot about foreign relations, or we haven't spoken much about foreign relations. We've spoken about China because of coronavirus. And this is going to touch on coronavirus, but really, there's a lot going on in the rest of the world that's pretty interesting, with different ways that countries are coping with this. And they're having different levels of success. And I want to talk about one in particular, which is Kerala. And Kerala is a state of India. Now, I don't know who's been to India, but I've got a bunch of Indian friends, and for some reason, when they get married, they want to do it in India. So I've been to India a few times, and one of those times, I went and spent a fair amount of time in Kerala. Now, Kerala is important because it's an incredibly unique state. The first thing that made it unique is that it had India's first case of coronavirus, and it quickly was the leader in the number of cases overall. But in a very short time, they've gotten from being the number 1 slot to the number 10 slot amongst all the states of India. And they are not necessarily the biggest state, but they are one of the most densely packed. Of all of the territories that India has, if you count, I'm not sure how the counting was done, but I'm going to say they are about the 13th largest state, and now they're the 10th most, they have the 10th most coronavirus cases, but they are the 8th most densely populated. And that's if you include the union territories, not just the states. If you only include states, they're the 5th most densely populated, but they've become the 10th highest ranked in coronavirus cases. And Kerala is also unique in that it's incredibly international. There's a lot of tourism there. It's in the south. It's warm. They have very popular tourist attractions like houseboats that you can go out on, all these interlocking rivers and what have you. So how was Kerala able to cope with coronavirus? Well, one of the things is they got out in front of it very early on. And the thing to understand about Kerala is that it's not like the rest of India at all. It has a 98% literacy rate. It has public health care. Before the federal government issued a lockdown, it was already issuing a 200,000 crore Indian currency stimulus package for the state. And why did they do this? Why does Kerala behave differently from the rest of India? How did they get their literacy so high? Kerala is extremely unique in that it's communist. I was there during election season. This is like 10 years ago now, or 6 years ago or something, during the elections, and there were banners, flyers everywhere with sickles and hammers and pictures of Marx and Engels. The communists in Kerala have been a very dominant force and have held power along with a coalition of leftist parties for decades. And this has resulted in two things. Well, this coupled with a very vibrant democracy, largely, or in part at least, because they have proportional representation, not a winner-take-all system like the United States. Your party is given seats in the legislature equivalent to the percentage your party wins in the elections. If the communists win 28% of the votes, they get 28% of the seats. And then the same goes for all the other parties. Because of this, they have had a very, very vibrant democracy, which has pushed the political parties, especially the ones on the left, who make promises of social services, to execute on and provide these social services. There were big pushes in the 60s and 70s around literacy, and they achieved 98% literacy. And this has led to a very highly educated population, much more highly educated than the rest of India on average, and a very, very civically engaged population, because they have seen that their participation in local elections makes a humongous difference, and in very tangible way to their everyday lives, because not only is there a robust civil society that works arm in arm with the government to provide social services and a conduit for people to engage, but social services are well run and well provided. So how did Kerala get out in front of coronavirus? One, it has a highly educated, engaged population. Two, it has public medicine so that people can get care and testing can be distributed. And three, because of this deep union between government and civil society and a civically engaged population, there is trust between the government and the people. So when the government says stay home, people understand that it is doing its job and looking out for them. This is basically the opposite of where the United States has gone in the last 50 years. Well, if you go 50 years back, we were pretty good at this. But if you go 20 or 30 years back, we were getting really bad at it. So we have a declining investment in education and an increasingly illiterate population and poorly educated population. We have a vibrant civil society in some places, but there is very little work between the government and the civil society, so that government work is not embedded in the work of local organizations, and local organizers don't operate within government. They're not pulled into government. We do not have a very vibrant political system because we have a winner-take-all model, which is geared around two major parties that make people feel like they have very little choice. Although I could go into all the ways that we do have choice with primaries and party leadership elections, but let's not get into it. People feel disenfranchised, so they don't participate, which leads to very low levels of trust between citizens and the government, which means that when orders come in to stay in your house, conspiracy theories start flying. And I really think Kerala is a prime example of where you can have social democracy, or straight up, they are unabashedly communist and they have a vibrant democratic state. So, it's extremely unfortunate, I think, that communism and left policies have been tied up with the idea of authoritarianism. And yeah, we can thank the Soviet Union for that and China for that, which are absolutely authoritarian states that truck under the mantle of communism. But communism is an economic system, and it's a way of distributing surplus economic production. It does not say anything per se about politics. And if it weren't for the fact that the Communist Manifesto spoke explicitly about a dictatorship of the proletariat, we probably wouldn't be here. That one phrase kind of destroyed communism because it led to the justification of deeply despotic rule in the first communist nations, which continues a legacy of left policies being identified with a particular form of governance. Now, one could theoretically say that, well, who would ever vote democratically to have their wealth extracted from them and redistributed? Well, I don't know, but it happens. It's happening in Kerala. It's happening in the social democracies of Europe. So, it seems to work, and it seems like you can balance democracy with redistribution of resources. But, people just don't buy that here in the United States. And I think it's one thing to say, I don't want resources redistributed. I like inequality because it leads to innovation and ambition and all these other qualities generally associated with market capitalism. But it's not okay to say that it is necessarily authoritarian, because there's plenty of authoritarian capitalist regimes as well. And it detracts from the entire debate about the sorts of economics we should be practicing and the vibrancy of our own democracy, because we simply rest on the fact that capitalism drives democracy, and we are capitalist, therefore we are democratic, when in fact we are neither. But no need to get into all that. Let's talk about, I don't know, people aren't commenting. I'm like happy to take questions or hear your opinions on this, but if folks don't want to comment on Carola, that's fine. Let's talk just for a second then about authoritarian communism in China, because there were a few things that came out recently that are super interesting, and it's like geopolitical stuff, and it's Sunday. I just feel like jamming, and I'm just talking to the screen, what have you. But again, feel free to weigh in, folks. One of the things that came out is, and this is super interesting, one of the provinces of China had a huge tiff with African immigrants, where there was a giant situation where they evicted basically everybody from all the African migrants from their home, and then took the men and dragged them in to detention cells to test them for coronavirus. It's basically, I don't really know where they're going with this, like whether they think coronavirus comes from Africa, because it came out of Wuhan, but this created a huge diplomatic rift between China and Africa. And these were migrants from multiple countries. There was a big display of displeasure by Nigeria, but these migrants came from countries all over Africa. And this is really important because raise your hand if you're familiar with the Belt and Road program. So Belt and Road was an economic diplomatic program, or still is really, run by China, which is effectively a new program. It was like modeled after it was basically the new Silk Road that became the Belt and Road program, which was basically a model to export Chinese capital to fund foreign development to win allies. And I don't know, if you've never read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I highly, highly recommend it, because this is exactly what China is doing, and it's modeled on what the United States did in the post-World War II economy. And some would call it economic imperialism. Yeah, it's economic imperialism. But, for a long time I resisted that, because I was honestly a good, proud American, and the United States is not an imperial power. But economic imperialism, and that's what it is. And the U.S. perfected this. And basically it works like this. You've got a developed country. So you make, you go and you play nice with them, and you offer them a big loan to build a piece of infrastructure that they need, say roads, or you might build a dam or whatever it is, like a hydroelectric dam. The United States did a lot of this in South America. Now, you make this big loan. What does the developing nation spend it on? Well, they don't have the expertise to develop these mega infrastructure projects at home, so they import the expertise, and they import the advanced machinery. They might have the resources, but they have to import these other higher value products. And from where do they import them? The loaning country. So basically, these loans are a subsidy to the industry of your country that then gets hired to do work in a developing nation. The size of these loans can be quite large. It might be so large that the country can't pay it back, but that's not a failure. That's not a bug. That's a feature, right? It's not a failure of the system. That's the point. When a country can't pay back the loan, they're permanently indebted to the creditor nation, and then they're basically in that country's pocket. So this is the model of economic imperialism, and effectively China's been doing this in Africa, like a lot over the last 10 years. So much so that it's basically displaced the United States, whose model has moved, I guess to our credit, from economic imperialism, largely, not that we don't do it, but it's moved from that model to one of foreign aid in Africa. A lot of people were really upset about the way that the United States practiced economic policy during the Cold War, but after the Cold War, it stopped being as much of a thing to like buy influence in client states. So China's been working on building up client states in Africa for a good 10 years, And as a result, African countries, which are largely, a large number of them are run by dictators that are very cozy with China and will just take the money, grift off a fair amount of it, and then run these infrastructure projects and just suppress dissent in their countries. There's been no dissent from African countries, for the most part, about Chinese activity, international relations, ever. And for the first time, there has been a public and publicized rift between multiple countries in Africa and China over Chinese mistreatment of African immigrants. Now, if this growing hegemony of China over an entire continent has honestly been something that's been pretty concerning to China watchers and foreign relations folks for a while. That being said, this would be an opportune moment for a competent, strategic, and well put together American administration to move in and start rebuilding or solidifying alliances in Africa and dropping a little bit of money in support. Oh, well, I guess that's just too bad because we don't have one of those. We don't have any extra money to spend because we've, particularly thanks to George Bush and Donald Trump, driven the United States into a gigantic financial hole. And so we cannot take advantage of this amazing strategic opportunity. So it looks like this is all going to shake out and China's just going to continue its expansion of influence, of its sphere of influence into Africa and whatever. There we go. Anyway, I wanted to mention that, though, because it's a really interesting encapsulation of a lot of different forces that are taking place in the foreign relations sphere. And I really don't think anybody talks enough about Africa, which, by the way, has some of the world's fastest growing economies, some of the world's fastest growing populations, and is turning out to be an incredibly dynamic continent that also has a demographic dividend coming its way. Most industrialized countries, including China, which, industrialized fairly recently, have a very aging population, and they're going to have to do a lot of supporting of the elderly through social benefit programs, or if you believe conspiracy theories, killing them through something like coronavirus on purpose. But Africa has a younger population. I think it's got the youngest population in the world. And so they're going to experience a demographic dividend in the next couple of years as a huge cohort of young people become young adults and enter the workforce. This is their opportunity to really see tremendous economic growth without governments being dragged down by the need to care for an aging population. A lot of really interesting demographic and geopolitical ideas wrapped up in what's happening between China and Africa right now. And the United States is just basically standing there like an idiot. And listen, people will argue that U.S. hegemony is bad and we shouldn't be involved in this way, but I'm not one of those people. I'd way rather, look, if you have to choose, I've always believed power is not something that just doesn't exist. People want to be like, we shouldn't exert power, people shouldn't exert power. Power is not something that ceases to exist because you say you don't want it. It flows from one position to another. In any given time, it might look like nobody has power, but power is always shifting. And if I'm going to choose a hegemonic power for the world, I'd way rather the United States than China. Even right now, I'd way rather the United States than China. When Donald Trump becomes a dictator, ask me again. But, any sort of democracy and a country that at least claims to uphold the values of democracy and practices elections in a real way, and even if you said our elections weren't real, in a realer way than China, that's preferable. And let me give you now the last piece of news coming out of China, which underscores this point. China just arrested 15 of the major pro-democracy organizers that led protests last August. It just swooped in and arrested them today. And it got 15 of them between the ages of 18 and 81. So one of them was like a very well-known civil rights lawyer. There were a couple of activist types who were out in the streets and leading the protests during the democracy movement. China just came in, picked them all up, and threw them in jail. And this was hours after the Chinese government issued a statement saying that it does not have to respect the Constitution of Hong Kong. So this, I think, speaking of, who's more democratic, who would like as the hegemonic power, and the fact that you can't get away from the fact that countries will vie for hegemonic supremacy or will, try to build their influence. If I'm going to choose a major influence for the world, I want one that is at least not scooping up pro-democracy activists and throwing them in jail and saying that it has the right to violate constitutions of its own territories. Now, that being said, technically, China's not a democracy, and Hong Kong's constitution was not written by Beijing. And so, yeah, sure, they can just disregard it, I guess. But it's an incredibly dangerous situation. And it raises one of the questions that we've been asking many, many times in these evening chats. What happens during a pandemic when democracy is on the line? So are the people of Hong Kong ready to risk their welfare and safety to fight for democracy? Yes. We saw last August that many people were willing to put their safety on the line to fight for democracy. But are they willing to put other people's safety on the line? The protests last August were largely young folk out there in the streets, and they wrote their goodbye notes to their parents saying this is the thing they have to do. But their parents were not out there. Yeah, I'm not saying that there were no people who were, there were no boomers, but for the most part, it was young people. And are those young people ready to put their parents at risk by reigniting a contagion of coronavirus to fight for their democracy? They're fine putting their own bodies on the line, but the problem with people who care about fighting for democracy is they tend to care an awful lot about society at large. And what is the responsibility that we have, not just to ourselves, but to other people when it comes to protesting and fighting openly and in the streets against anti-democratic powers, when doing so puts people who aren't ourselves at risk? I mean, there's not really an answer to this question. I'm really interested to see what the Hong Kongers do, because I think they've been the most effective at fighting totalitarian rule, and they have a real totalitarian enemy. We talk a lot about, how undemocratic things are getting in the United States, but it's nothing compared to China. Although I do ask, would we even know? China is very obvious. They're very obviously authoritarian. It's very obvious that they're out there to subdue Hong Kong. At what point, particularly because Hong Kong has this clear delineation, they can make a call as to whether or not they're going to go out and protest. And I'm curious to see what they do. But here in the United States, at what point do people stand up and go outside despite the pandemic? And the big question is would we even know it if it were here in the United States? Because right now we have a president who says basically what China says, I don't have to respect the Constitution. I have total authority. I can open and close states at my will. It doesn't matter what the state constitutions say, and it doesn't matter what the 10th Amendment says. Am I saying that we're in the same place as China? Absolutely not, because our states are robust, right? We have our own governments. We have our own militias and National Guard and police forces. And I don't think that the federal government is coming to New York in the way that China can go to Hong Kong. But, this is a really interesting question. And again, it speaks to the geopolitics of it. A big issue as well right now is the status of Taiwan, because Taiwan saw what was happening in China early, had observer status in the WHO, the timeline, I've done the timeline wrong. The Taiwan, which is not recognized as a separate government from Beijing because of the one China policy, which I'm not going to get into it, but, Taiwan used to be an observer nation, as it didn't have a vote, couldn't speak. It was an observer nation in the WHO. It has observer status in a lot of different places because, again, it's not its own country, but people want Taiwan involved. due to objections from China, Taiwan was fairly recently ejected from the WHO, lost its observer status, lost its capacity to participate. Taiwan saw what was happening in China pretty early, locked down its borders, sent a message to the WHO. And this is where the whole I'm pulling funding from the WHO thing kind of gets its credence. The WHO ignored Taiwan's warnings. It ignored it because it's not supposed to be listening to Taiwan, because China doesn't want the WHO engaging with this non-state entity. It doesn't want anybody engaging with this non-state entity. And so this does give a little bit of credence to the idea that, well, the WHO is not doing the best possible job because it's ignoring a very advanced, productive regional economy with a transparent democracy that borders China. That being said, there's a lot of geopolitics being brought up by the coronavirus. Taiwan is one. This Hong Kong thing is another. The Belt and Road and China's influence in Africa is a third. The basically racism that it's exposing in China towards Africans is a fourth. And Asia really is right now, and has been for a long time, a powder keg. In fact, we could go into India. We were just talking about India a few minutes ago for folks tuning in, talking about India and the state of Kerala. But we could also talk about India and Narendra Modi, who's the prime minister, his authoritarian tendencies, the fact that they stripped a border state with Pakistan of rights. This is Kashmir. Asia has been for a while a powder keg, but now things are kicking into even higher gear. And I had a conversation with a friend some time ago about, where is, World War III? And World War III, as far as I'm concerned, is the United States. At the time, I was like, the United States devolves into civil war and is too distracted to even impose its ideas on the rest of the world. And so at that time, I was like, yeah, if the United States descends into civil war, it's not that the U.S., it's not that Donald Trump nukes another country or starts his own war that kicks off civil war. It's that the United States withdraws completely from the global stage. Russia moves deeply into Ukraine and maybe starts moving into other Baltic territories or Caucasus regions. And China starts being aggressive in its home turf. Now, you don't need a civil war in the United States to completely remove America from the world stage. A pandemic which is not handled well in the United States and completely deprives the United States of its capacity to be responsive or to generate its main resource, which is a shit ton of money, will really deteriorate and erode the capacity of the West, I guess, for lack of a better term, and this sort of includes Europe, to respond to threats in other areas. And this is because we're, as democracies, largely concerned about our native populations. Well, that makes it sound like the federal government cares about Native Americans, and it doesn't, because one thing we haven't spoken about is how it's been stealing land from native reservations, but from native territories. But we'll get to that some other time, I guess. But democracies care a lot about domestic integrity because people vote. China doesn't have to worry about that. Russia doesn't have to worry about that. They have to keep the population subdued, which doesn't mean happy, and it can resolve to a lot of lying to make people feel like the government's doing a decent job. But then they can focus their time and attention and resources where they want, and that can be abroad. And it's a perfect opportunity to sow instability and to move deeply into less well-resourced countries. So I'm not saying we're on the doorstep of World War III, but I do think that we might see some aggressive posturing as the U.S. continues to be deeply, deeply distracted by its incapacity to deal with coronavirus. That being said, some positive news. It looks like the curve's flattening out in New York. Let's hope that all of the southern states doing their best to create an exponential growth curve don't send a bunch of COVID people to our socially distancing city, because deaths have come down for a second straight day in a row, which means that if this trend continues, we could be seeing, the ultimate flattening and perhaps decrease in deaths from coronavirus and decrease in the spread. I will say, as I mentioned yesterday, I spoke to my brother today, actually really cool news, which is indicative of where we're headed. I mentioned yesterday that my brother said that the number of people entering the hospital is now roughly equivalent to the number of people exiting the hospital. So now we have fewer people getting sick than are recovering, which is great. Basically means we're stable. His hospital is completely full, but still it's stable. And he told us today that I had mentioned a couple of, maybe like a week and a half ago, that his hospital asked him to fill out a form. What would be his preferred place to go away from psychiatry, so that he can be a frontline, on the front lines in ICU or emergency department. And he was very unhappy about this because he didn't want to go to either of those places, and he got into medicine to practice psychiatry. And apparently, the situation is such that they're not going to have to redeploy him, which is great for him. Obviously, I'm happy about it. My family's happy about it because it puts him out of harm's way. He was having to do, he still has to go to these departments when there's a psychiatric issue, but it says something that they no longer feel like they have to redeploy him as a doctor to a department that's not his specialty. So it says, I think that's a very positive indicator, and hopefully that sort of keeps up. Now, there were some questions or comments or whatever, so I'll just scroll back and address them. Let's see. Julianne, Marx destroyed himself. My high school communist manifesto. Huh? Carrying Che Guevara Howard himself is crying. Yes, Carola is awesome. Isn't trying to influence African countries just post-colonialism? I think it's like straight up colonialism. It's only post-colonialism if the West does it because we got over colonialism. But, when did China denounce colonialism? I guess communist countries technically are anti-imperialist and they decry Western imperialism. But I don't know a more imperialist country than the Soviet Union. My friend said that people in Africa are being racist towards Asian people as well. Listen, people are just racist. Everybody's racist. It's what are the consequences of that racism? And a bunch of Africans got evicted in one of the Chinese provinces, and a bunch of all the men were detained, and it created a skirmish. I mean, well, white people in America are racist too. Do you think that Russia will invade Ukraine further sooner? I doubt that. Dorian liked my comment about race, I guess. They could say that the fires in Chernobyl and They could say that the fires in Chernobyl and the pandemic were mishandled, that this could be used as a smokescreen to invade. Also, he could, presumably Putin, form an alliance with Orban. I think they have been friendly in the past. I think it's unlikely that Russia is going to invade Ukraine in any sort of militaristic way, at least openly. They'll continue their low-key war and their destabilization attempts. But I suspect that there's not, instability is a prime time for war, but it also is a situation where you have so many other options because things are unstable that moving straight to war, which is very obvious, is quite possibly the least good of your options. There are lots of ways to generate support for your country and to take over using soft power when there's instability in a country, and regions, might just voluntarily break off. Russia's been really good at installing sort of puppet leaders. So I doubt, particularly Putin, who's like, he's KGB. He's not, FSA. I forget what the Russian military is, but he's got the mindset of somebody who prefers not to be oblique about his methods. Dorian, can we be anti-Chinese, not anti-Asian, because some Asians are our allies? I'm not even anti-Chinese. I'm just anti-Chinese communist government. They are awful. India, thanks for sharing the good news about New York death rates ceasing to climb. Yes, I mean, at least for days. And other good news, Israel reports that that's at home. That's fantastic to hear, because also people need companionship in these times when they can't see or touch other human beings, and dogs are great for that. So it would certainly be terrible if dogs could transmit the disease. And do you have anything about cats? Because I remember that a tiger caught it, and it would not be cool if cats could carry and transmit the disease to humans. Dorian asks, do you think we will reopen on May 15th? To that, I can only ask, who is we? Do you mean the United States as a whole? No. New York? No. No, I don't think. I think if we continue to see the death rate decline between now and May 15th, we'll see limited reopenings of things with strict measures. But obviously, the rest of the country, like South Carolina, Florida, and Texas, are already on their way to reopening. So some folks are going to be open by May 15th. Dorian also asked, what do you think of Germany sending China a bill for $130 billion for corona damages? I think it's a stunt. It's a stunt. And China's not going to pay that. And I heard that China was upset, but that's just their typical playing the victim. That's what China does. They were, of course, really beset upon by the West for 100 years. But ever since then, they've basically just been riding that out. Everything the West does is, it's always the work of foreign powers. Like everything that goes wrong in China is the work of foreign capitalists foreign capitalist imperialists. Well, no, the Chinese government makes a fair number of its own mistakes and lays its own beds, but it can always fall back on Western colonialism as its whipping boy. And this is problematic because it actually works. The intense Chinese nationalism has worked to prop up the regime in Beijing and prevent, democracy from rising, because nationalism provides legitimacy to the regime, which takes a hard tone towards Europe and the United States. So I think this just plays into that. Doesn't really change anything. They're not going to get that money from China. Like, how are they going to do that? And so a fun headline is like a nice thing for Germany to say to its people. Now, if you gathered up the United Nations or like a lot of countries to demand money from China, maybe you could get something by threat of force or coercion, or like Africa and Southeast Asia buying up and Central Europe, Central Eurasia, I should say, buying up allies. So, the EU and the United States really have to pick up their diplomacy game. And of course, you don't have to go into this, but Trump destroyed the State Department. So U.S. diplomacy game, while this is the perfect time for it to be at an all-time high, is at an all-time low. And this just came out. Illinois is, the governor of Illinois sent a private charter jet to China to pick up PPE because he was afraid the federal government would intercept it and steal it. Right now, we can't even practice diplomacy in our own bloody country. The federal government is intercepting paid-for shipments of PPE to, let's see, Massachusetts, Illinois, Germany, Vietnam, and one other country, and Haiti. So, we're destroying our credibility all over the planet within our own country. And so how are we going to develop the foreign policy wherewithal to do anything to push back on China? The whole thing with Russia is it trying to expand their sphere of influence? The whole thing with Russia is trying to expand their sphere of influence. Yes. Simultaneously like the West, but I hate it. I don't, that last sentence I don't understand. But Russia's definitely, Putin's obsessed with reassembling the USSR. James is responding to Dorian. Wasn't that just a newspaper rather than the government? Oh, well, I don't know. Nah, neither do I. It's not like we care about the international flaps of the New York Post. Was it a newspaper that sent the demand to China? that would make it definitely less interesting. But if it was the German government, that'd be funny. Julian asked, how did the damn cat get it? Did a human get within 16 feet of the tiger? Like, really? And the answer is, yes, it did. It was the handler. And haven't you watched Tiger King? That's how it works. India, we still do not know about cats. Stay tuned. I will stay tuned. India, you are my resource and lifeline for all animal science. So I'm staying tuned. I hope they can't spread it. Yes, you love cats. Dorian, what do you make of the anti-lockdown rallies in red and purple states? Trump urging them on in Michigan. What's to be said except that they're crazy? Honestly, so we spoke about this, I think, over the last 2 days. A couple of things to be said about that. First, in North Carolina, in Raleigh, they arrested a protester for doing this. And I think that's obviously a very dangerous, slippery slope. I don't care what people are protesting about. It's the government's job to provide the explanation and resources that people need to make them feel good about government policy, not to punish them or corral them when they dissent. So my first thought is these people are well within their rights to stage peaceful protests about government policy, even though I think it's stupid, or even though I think it's the wrong thing to protest. Other than that, what's to be said other than we are doing such a miserable, and this goes right back to Carola, what I was saying about why Carola has done such a fantastic job. The reason we have this problem is because our system is so fundamentally messed up. Education in the United States has been divested from for years and years and years. So people are not well informed. We have complete bifurcation of our media and political landscape. Our politics are broken because there's so much money in them, and the electoral systems we use are biased towards status quo interests. And then because people don't feel like they have a choice, there is a sense of disenfranchisement and therefore distrust in elected officials. So I think that the protests point to a much, much deeper problem in the United States. And even if you were going to say that all of these protests are the result of funding from billionaires to create a grass tops illusion that there is an anti-lockdown movement and it's not real. One, that's how the Tea Party started, but the Tea Party ended up being quite effective. And two, it still points to the broken reality of American politics and facets of it which absolutely need fixing, which are the same. One, money in politics. Two, a sense of disenfranchisement, which is what allows people to believe that these things are real protests. And three, that disenfranchisement is what allows billionaires to come in and fund these grass tops, as opposed to grassroots movements, to create a sense of movement. Because people are so disconnected from civic engagement and from policy and from government that they are ready to buy into these protests. And yeah, there's some things in American culture like American exceptionalism and the cult of individuality or individualism or what have you. But ultimately, these protests are really a consequence of the education and the political systems. As for Trump egging them on, disgraceful. Absolutely. The way he goes about it, I could see him disagreeing with a president can disagree with the policy of a state, but to say liberate as if you're trying to cultivate an insurrection against duly elected officials in your country over territories like you don't control. I said it the other day. It's effectively treasonous, and it's incredible to watch a president come out and call on people to overturn policy and government by protest and not through elections. It's just a freaking disgrace. He can disagree with the policy, and he can say he doesn't like the policy, and he can call on people to combat the policy through elections. He can be highlighting candidates. We're having an election in a few months. That's how it should be done. Liberate, which connotes potentially armed insurrection, and people are showing up with their machine guns on the stoops of capitals. It's not good. It's not done the right way. It's not done in a just and democratic way. Even though I don't think you'd necessarily pin this on him, he would just say, that's not what I meant by liberate. But the lines that we're going up to and not crossing are just, we are right there. We haven't crossed the Rubicon, but it's just standing on one side of it, looking at the other bank, chopping trees down for a bridge. Although I don't know if you can actually bridge the Rubicon. I don't know if it's that big or small of a river, but you get the idea. Julianne. No, he doesn't want the USSR. He wants the power and sphere of influence. He wants a relationship with the West economically. He doesn't, for many historical reasons, want a relationship with the West. He wants a relationship with the West economically. He doesn't, for historical reasons, want a relationship with the West. So he does or does not want a relationship with the West. And I disagree. I think he does want to reassemble the USSR and is moving to reassert influence in every former territory of the Soviet Union. He wants economic trade because the economy was so terrible under the USSR. I'm not saying he's a Soviet communist. I'm saying he wants to reassemble the territory of the Soviet Union. He wants to continue to expand his sphere of influence. Russia has a weird national psychology. They are not West or East completely. Well, that's what you get for having a continent-sized country. They call their supporters Trump's army. Who calls them that? Al, what's going on? This is the very, very tail end, I think. Not just because we've exhausted all the comments and all the things I wrote down, but also because now I'm hungry. I should have eaten before, and I didn't. I was like, this won't go that long. And now, what the hell time is it? I've been at this for like an hour. It's almost 9:30. Anyway, thank you, everybody, for tuning in. It's been a real treat, as always. And I will see you all tomorrow at 8:30 in the Fireplace, which I'm now considering calling the 8:30. Leave your comments as to which one you like more. Bye.